How would you survive in the Paleolithic with Neanderthals? Well, that's the question I asked myself. I'm Louise, and I'm not a survival expert, but I am an archaeologist. So I consulted the Wikipedia page for survival skills, watched a few Bear Grylls TV shows, and then looked at the archaeological record to see how Neanderthals would have done each of those things. I've then combined it to create this video, a guide for survival in the Paleolithic over 40,000 years ago, for any trip you might be planning to take there. This is part of my Time Traveler's Guide to Neanderthals series, but each of these episodes functions as a standalone guide. Fire meets multiple survival needs. It can provide warmth, it can provide a predator deterrent, and it gives you the ability to cook food. The use of fire developed over millions of years, from harvesting naturally occurring fires, to then maintaining those, to then deliberately making fire. But it's difficult to tell exactly when that last stage happened. However, there's some recent evidence from Barnham in Suffolk, which is in England, which pushed back deliberate fire making to 400,000 years ago, which is 350,000 years earlier than previously thought. Researchers found heat-fractured hand axes, baked sediments, and iron pyrite. Iron pyrite is also known as fool's gold, and when you strike it against flint, it can create sparks which can be used to create fire. Researchers found 2 pieces at this site, but local geological studies show that it doesn't really occur in the area naturally, suggesting it was deliberately brought by the inhabitants to make fire. This has massive implications for human evolution. Our species, Homo sapiens, wasn't out of Africa yet. This shows that a different species had fire-making ability. Fire is a useful tool for survival, as I already said, but it's also a really important social tool as it provides a space for people to gather. And then you've also got the ability to cook, which allows you to digest food more easily, providing you with more energy, which is crucial for brain evolution. So what species was here? Well, no human fossils have been found at Barnham. However, this layer of activity is the same date as another site, Swanscombe, where a skull was found. This skull likely belonged to an early Neanderthal, so we can infer that the people making fires at Barnham were probably early Neanderthals too. So if you're travelling back to the Paleolithic, I'd recommend finding some fool's gold to use as a fire starter, so then you might have a better chance of even making it through your first night. We have other evidence of Neanderthals using fire at Abric Romani, which is a rock shelter in Spain which Neanderthals inhabited 39 to 70,000 years ago. There's really good preservation here because the site periodically flooded, which has preserved 17 layers of occupation and hundreds of hearths have been discovered. One phase, dated to 58,000 years ago, contained over 40 hearths, the most of any of the layers. Some of them were smaller in diameter, around 50 centimetres, and then there were larger ones in the centre. These smaller ones were placed about 1 to 2 metres from the rock shelter wall, and there were gaps between them where the inhabitants would have slept. And some fossilised plant remains give trace evidence that grass could have been brought in to be used as bedding. The larger hearths would have been for daytime activities like stone tool production and processing the spoils of hunting, and each hearth might have had its own separate function. The hearth at this site structured both the space and life, providing safety, a tool, warmth, and that social element. In a survival situation, direct exposure to the element increases the threat to your life, so an effective shelter is essential. These can come in many forms, but the common elements are: it needs to be away from hazards, insulated from the ground, wind and rain, have a heat source, and be near materials. Neanderthals were mobile. They moved between different sites to exploit resources and were not permanently settled. However, during some points of climate instability, they might have had more permanent base camps and targeted trips out for hunting. The archaeological record is naturally more skewed towards cave dwellings. Caves protect from direct exposure to the elements and provide a more stable environment, which results in better preservation of materials, especially when compared to an open-air site. Also, the longer an occupation of a site, the more materials that are created, which leads to more chance of something surviving today. and as caves are static points on the landscape, it's more likely that Neanderthals would have returned to them than an open-air temporary settlement. This sustains this sort of caveman misconception, because most temporary structures just simply haven't survived. But it isn't just caves, the evidence for built structures is growing. You do get rock shelter sites like Abec Romani, which I discussed before, where the halves structured the space, and this was overlooking a valley rich in vegetation. There was materials nearby for stone tool productions, and animals would pass through the valley like deer, horses and aurochs. Another rock shelter site is Tor Faraj in southern Jordan. This is around 1,000 kilometres above sea level and an open savanna type environment that Neanderthals lived in roughly 70 to 50,000 years ago. They also used multiple halves for different purposes and slept in between smaller ones. But what I love about this site is the Neanderthals living here constructed a windbreak at the cave entrance that doubled as a fuel storage area. This demonstrates using the half to structure the living space and the human modification of an existing structure. Neanderthals weren't just rocking up to caves and just sitting in them, twiddling their thumbs, they were making use of these spaces. Now moving into these more built structures. 84 to 72,000 years ago, Neanderthals stopped by a river in a site that's called now La Folie in France, and soon after they left, this river flooded and preserved their activity, giving us a rare glimpse into one of these temporary shelters. There was a roughly circular post hole arrangement found, about 10 metres in diameter, and this has been interpreted as a large circular windbreak, and the sides were likely covered in animal skins, and it probably wasn't roofed as it was a bit too large. And the space inside was also still organised. They had an area for napping, an area for processing, and the bedding was at the furthest point from the entrance, which is also devoid of artefacts. The Neanderthals would have been sleeping. It makes sense, you're away from the immediate threat of danger if anything entered this sort of area. And so this is an amazing campsite area showing that Neanderthals built these temporary structures if they were just stopping at a location in a landscape. And I think this shows just a whole other side of them. Remaining in France, in Bruniquel Cave, 336 metres deep in, Neanderthals created a ring and accumulation structure of broken stalagmites, and traces of fire were also found here. And this is dated to 176,500 years ago. So Neanderthals by this point had mastered the underground environment. It would have been so dark down there that artificial lighting probably would have been necessary, and they were capable of creating these elaborate structures, the function of which is still unknown. And this was made during a cold period in the MIS 65. But calcite flows on the main ring of the surface were a similar age to the structure, showing that the climate was warm and humid enough to allow calcite deposition despite the general glacial conditions outside. This might mean the construction may date to a warmer phase of the cold phase, or the cave might have provided refuge from the Arctic conditions. Neanderthals used mammoths for food, but what about as a building material? Well, this is what our next built structure example might have used. This is an open air site in Ukraine known as Moldova 1, where researchers found 40,000 lithics with 3,000 mammal bones, most of which belong to mammoths. And this is dated to 44,000 years ago in MIS 3. Areas included a pit filled with bones, different activity areas, 25 halves, and a circular accumulation made of mammoth bones that's been interpreted as a dwelling structure created by Neanderthals. The mammoth meat on the bones had been eaten, and then the bones were selected and arranged into this sort of structure. Inside were 15 halves, lithics, butchery waste, and cooking, which is characteristic of a domestic space. Later in the Upper Paleolithic, dwelling structures made of mammoth bones have been found in Ukraine and Russia, but this is much earlier. Now, these aren't just shelters, there is an image of home, and maybe Neanderthals invented the concept of home. Matt Pope suggests that this concept of a Neanderthal home is based on 5 principles that are still recognisable as today: prospect, They're set in a desirable location. The Neanderthal preferred place was about a third of the way up the slope, with clear views below and above. Refuge, they are sheltered away from the elements and predators. Convergence, this is a unified domestic space. Transformation, a place to experiment and create materials, with fire at the heart of all of this. And finally, sociability. Human species have lived in groups for millions of years, and a shared space changes the way we interacted. The key element that made this concept of a home possible is fire, providing light, warmth, protection, a social space, and the ability to cook. I think I've made it quite important that cooking is important, but just how much did a Neanderthal need to consume? Well, estimates on calorie intake do vary, but the suggested numbers are well above the average for an anatomically modern human forager. So don't go eating as much as the Neanderthals are eating, as you probably don't need that much. And the reasons because of this, well, there's a few put forward. Models suggest that Neanderthal daily energy expenditure may have reached or exceeded 5,500 calories per day. And to put that into perspective, that's 5 tubs of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Which maybe that's not that much. But never mind. Anyway, throughout this next section, take that into consideration. This is how much the Neanderthals might be consuming. Historically, Neanderthals have been viewed as scavengers, but in reality they were apex predators and incredibly adaptable. Neanderthals in Gibraltar were hunting and scavenging seals and dolphins, while Neanderthals in Siberia were hunting bison across the cold open steppe. So there's a lot of regional variation, and they basically consumed what was abundant in their immediate surroundings. Therefore, their hunting strategies had to be mixed, and they would have probably developed specific tactics depending on what animal they were hunting, the age of that particular animal, and how abundant it was in the landscape. They would have hunted these in groups, and it has been suggested that their physique suited close-range hunting ambushes. So the menu and how you're procuring that menu is looking quite varied. Now, just to demonstrate how tactical Neanderthal hunting strategies could be, I've got an example from Neumark Nord 1 in Germany, where thousands of straight-tusked elephant bones were discovered from over 70 individual animals with entire skeletons, stomach contents, and random bones. This now extinct species of elephant were more than 13 feet tall and weighed between 6 to 13 tons, which is roughly the same as 8 mid-sized cars. Re-examination of this material revealed repetitive strategic cut marks, suggesting Neanderthals were carefully butchering them for their fat, meat, and brains, and this behaviour persisted for over 2,000 years across generations. Dismembering one of these straight-tusked elephants would take one person 200 to 600 hours, and one would produce a massive amounts of meat. We're talking 2,500 portions of around 4,000 calories. That's enough to feed 25 Neanderthals for 3 months, 100 for a month, and 350 for a week. They utilised every bit of the animal, even the fat pads on the bottom of their feet. The sheer amount of food suggests Neanderthals knew how to store or preserve meat, likely by drying or smoking it. We have some potential evidence for smoking at Abric Romani, where the hearth at the site had stones placed under combustible material which could have generated more smoke, which could have been used for smoking meat. Many of the elephants at the site were older male ones, suggesting they were actively hunting these and not just scavenging ones that had died from other causes. This is because the male elephants would often roam alone, while the female ones would be in groups to protect young. And the Neanderthals would have known this. It's suspected they might have drove them into pits or muddy areas and killed them with spears. Eating too much protein can be bad for you. When eating largely animal food, a forager's total daily protein is limited to no more than roughly 5 grams per kilogram of body weight. For hunter-gatherers like Neanderthals with body weights between 50 and 80 kilograms, the upper limit of daily protein intake is about 300 grams a day. just 1,200 calories, which is a lot less than their required daily amount. Sustained intake above this 300 gram fresh mark can lead to a debilitating, potentially lethal condition known as rabbit starvation. So the rest of your daily calories has to come from other sources. But a lot of Neanderthal diet studies do suggest they did focus their diet on large terrestrial herbivores. I gave you a rough number before of Neanderthal calorie intake at about 5,500 a day. One study took this number and modelled this diet, focusing on the consequences of it on a pregnant Neanderthal woman. If she ate 5,500 calories a day, derived almost exclusively from large land herbivores, it would kill her and her developing fetus. The researchers put forward 9 potential lessons this study demonstrates: an underappreciation of Neanderthals' ability to regulate body temperature, efficiently hunt terrestrial animals, degree of sexual division of labour, especially for pregnant and lactating women, the amount of non-mammal and plant food consumed by Neanderthals, differences in metabolic processing, and the role of micronutrient deficiencies in Neanderthal extinction. It may have also been exaggerated the degree of mobility in the average Neanderthal groups, and the degree of close encounter hunting techniques Neanderthal women actually participated in. These aren't conclusions, just potential alternative suggestions. And this demonstrates how much the picture of Neanderthal diet, mobility, and social structure is not complete, and we've still got a lot to learn. That said, there is a lot of evidence that Neanderthals did also eat plants. Dental calculus and tool residues show Neanderthals consumed as many plant species as early modern humans across Europe, Middle East and Africa. And some examples include Kibara Cave, where 48 different plant taxa were identified. These include legumes, barley, acorns, pistachios and wild peas, which suggests a spring occupation of this particular site. At Shanidar Cave, roughly 70,000 years ago, charred food remnants include what might be the world's oldest meal. Seeds from a nearby cave were used to recreate a flatbread, and it was described as having a nutty taste. Charred wild olives and pine nuts were found at Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, and there was also beach cobbles that had been marked by plant processing. In winter and spring, another problem starts to appear. Plants are harder to come by, and as we've established, you need another food source. Fat, especially bone lipids, is a crucial resource for hunter-gatherers in most environments, but especially for foragers whose diet is based heavily on animal foods. And we've got evidence that Neanderthals knew how amazing fat was. And we're back at the Newmark Nord lake site, but just in a slightly different area. And here, roughly 125,000 years ago, Neanderthals gathered to extract the grease from animal bones. Over 100,000 bone fragments have been discovered from at least 172 individual animals, included foxes, horses, big cats, and an extinct type of rhinoceroses, along with anvils, hammerstones, flint tools, and traces of fire. The bones had been broken into pieces, especially in places containing the most fat, and then heated to extract the marrow and grease. This fat factory would have provided them with incredibly important nutrients that they were obviously aware of. The previous oldest known use of grease rendering was 28,000 years ago, and at this site we've got Neanderthals doing it almost 100,000 years earlier. Neanderthals also exploited marine and coastal resources. Bony growths found in Neanderthals' ears suggest that aquatic foraging was actually quite a big part of some of their lives. This condition is known as surfer's ear, as it develops with exposure to cold water and damp wind chill, and a high frequency of it among Neanderthals suggests frequent aquatic resource exploitation. Furthermore, at one site at a cave in Italy, shell tools were discovered that might have been retrieved from up to 13 metres deep in the water. And finally, one paper suggests that human presence on some Greek islands actually started in the Middle Palaeolithic, 110,000 years ago, which indicates inter-island to mainland seafaring by Neanderthals. However, more evidence is needed to further explore this one. On the theme of water, where would you drink from? Well, you've got your direct sources like lakes and rivers. Just try and make sure you're drinking from water that's running. You don't want to be drinking stagnant water. But diet is another big thing. Especially if you cook food, it might be able to absorb some water into it if you do it through boiling. And at Abric Romani, we might have some evidence of this. A shallow depression was found in the ground that could have been filled with water, and if you dropped hot stones into it, it would have let the water boil for cooking or creating steam. Navigation is of course going to be important. You don't just want to arrive and start wandering around the exact same place in circles for hours. And your modern map is of course going to be absolutely useless. Britain at this time isn't even an island yet, it's still connected to the rest of mainland Europe by a patch of land known as Doggerland, which I do have a video on if you'd like to go and watch that. And the landscape is different and changing a lot in the Paleolithic with climate instability. To get around, Neanderthals likely used river valleys as natural highways and travelled during the warmer periods. This is what computer simulated paths to explore how the Neanderthals reached the Altai Mountains have suggested, and this movement was of approximately 2,000 miles and may have took less than 2,000 years. Other traditional techniques likely existed, such as using landmarks, mentally remembering routes, and using the sun and stars. Your modern tools might not last for the entire trip, so you need to know the Neanderthal equivalents. They're mostly associated with the Mousterian lithic industry, which spanned from approximately 300,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago, and is developed out of the earlier Acheulean industry. And they're especially associated with the Levallois technique, where a striking platform is formed at one end, and then the cored edges are trimmed by flaking off pieces of it to create an outline of the intended lithic flake. This creates sort of a dome shape on the side of the core, hence why it's known as a tortoise core, as it looks sort of like a tortoise's shell. There's quite a lot of different types of flint tools. These include points, scrapers, denticulates, which have like a tubed edge like a sword, hand axes, and knives. Depending on the availability of the raw material, tools were often resharpened and reused. There has been suggested there's been a limited innovation in this technology, and this might have been due to the small population size of Neanderthals. Tool evidence mostly consists of stone tools because stone survives a lot longer than wood does, but there are some very rare examples. You have the Clacton spear. This was discovered in 1911 in Clacton-on-Sea in England, and is approximately 400,000 years old, and it's the oldest known worked wooden weapon. It's made of yew wood by either early Neanderthals or maybe Homo heidelbergensis. Its most likely use was a thrusting or throwing spear, but the extent to which Neanderthals could throw has been debated. A 2019 study suggested they could hit prey up to 20 meters away with a spear. However, this is using human-trained javelin throwers, and they hit the 20 meter target with about 17% accuracy, and they hit the 10 meter target 25% of the time. They said the 20 meter range is double that was expected if a hand-thrown spear could be used, so there could be something in that, but I don't think we'd probably know if we didn't have a Neanderthal running the experiment, as the physical makeup of a Neanderthal's shoulder has been debated to the extent they could throw, and the injury pattern that has been observed across Neanderthal remains does suggest this close proximity hunting style. We have got another spear example of the Schöningen spears, which are a set of 10 Paleolithic wooden weapons. These are the oldest complete wooden weapons we've found, but the date is debated, ranging from 400 to 200,000 years old. A 2025 study attributes the younger age to around 200,000 years old and deems that they were created by Neanderthals. These were constructed from Norway spruce and spine, and used as both throwing weapons and thrusting spears. Their flint tools could be hafted to wood by using adhesive birch tar that also has medicinal properties. This is the oldest synthetic substance made by humans, and the earliest examples of it are made by Neanderthals. At Königshaus in Germany, Neanderthals used an underground distillation method that restricted oxygen flow and remained invisible during the process. It's not the simplest method available to distill tar, suggesting that this process had developed over generations. The earliest evidence of tar-based Neanderthal technology comes from central Italy and dates to about 190,000 years ago. The birch tar used by Neanderthals predates any known adaptation by modern humans by about 100,000 years. There's no direct evidence of clothing. The only known clothing-related tools are hide scrapers. There's no evidence of any bone needles or stitching awls. The hide scrapers suggest sort of blanket or poncho type garments rather than fitted tailored clothes. Anterior dental microwear analysis, similar to ethnographic examples of people who clamp hides with their teeth while preparing them, suggesting similar behaviour by Neanderthals. Ethnographic modelling of 245 hunter-gatherer groups was used to predict the clothing coverage by temperature, wind speed and rainfall. And they predicted that for Neanderthals, up to 80% body coverage would be necessary in winter for some populations, and likely was non-tailored. Some populations would probably have had to cover their hands and feet. This still accounts for this maybe potential higher cold tolerance that Neanderthals had, but still significant coverage would have been necessary. Mammals that are used for cold weather clothing, like rabbits, canids, foxes, do appear in Neanderthal sites, so they weren't using these animals, but they appear more frequently in early modern human sites, suggesting that modern humans were creating more sophisticated fur-trimmed outfits. A cape-like clothing is more likely for Neanderthals, where modern humans might have had more specialised cold tailoring, which could be a possible factor in the Neanderthal extinction debate. I hope this information has given you a bit of a basis for how to survive in the Paleolithic with Neanderthals as the example. So, do you think you could do it? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe for more archaeology content. Thank you for exploring the distant past with me. There's always more to uncover, so I'll see you in the next video.